everyone. Welcome to our first Going Organic webinar series for the 2024 fall. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have a lot of subscribers around the world. Sometimes the time differences, they cannot join. So this session will be recorded. I welcome you all to our series. My name is Dil Thavaraja. I'm a professor at the Clemson University. I oversee the Organic Pulse Quality and Nutritional Breeding Program. Our program is supported by several funders to do these all wonderful things. I am really grateful. National Institute of Food and Agriculture, our regional South Carolina Department of Agriculture, several programs funding our program, and also USDA ARS, especially Pullman, Washington, and then the Food Shot Global. I thank you all our funders to helping us to do this kind of webinar series and all the research that we do. With that, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Casey Johnson. Dr. Johnson was one of my first graduate students from my program. Casey Johnson, he got his BS in zoology at the North Dakota State University, and then he got his master's in my program and pulse quality and nutrition. And then he became a doctor. He went to the Mayo Medical School and he got his MD, and he worked there after he graduated as a resident. And now he is a clinical fellow and the postdoctoral fellow at the Boston Children's Hospital. And his current research focus on epithelial biology of the human intestine. And he has been a wonderful advocate for pulse crops, and not for the adults, also for the children and the future generation. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, joining today. So the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. And Dil, it is always such a pleasure to see you and talk with you. So I'm hopeful to give you guys a really fun talk today. And if you got your chats up, I really, my favorite is when people can just interrupt me and chat, but I think today we're going to hold questions to the end. So let me share my screen. But I'm going to have a whole bunch of questions for you. So ready, get your chats ready. So can everybody see me okay?
Yes, everything
right.
Good.
So without further ado, I'm going to tell you an interesting story about the history of humanity in the food system and pulse crops and how they fit in with human health. Okay. I have no disclosures to make. And the objectives that we're going to go over today is we're going to try and identify some historical relationships between agriculture and nutrition that I think you'll think are very interesting. We'll describe the impact and extent of some of these dietary health consequences. And then lastly, I'm going to try to convince you why pulse crops are extremely important for a sustainable food system. And so the outline for what we're going to talk about today, we'll go through an introduction where we'll go way back in history and think about a historical context of agriculture, food systems, and nutrition. We'll talk about malnutrition and dietary health consequences of our food system. And then we'll end talking about pulse crops. So can anybody name this place? I'll give you a couple seconds to fire it in the chat. I guess I can't see the chat. Oh, there it is. Okay. Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, brilliant. So this is the birthplace of agriculture. So we're going back 12,000 plus years ago in what is modern day Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and a few other countries. And this is where it all started. This is where some of the founder crops were first domesticated. So, some of the ancient wheat varieties, hulled barley, peas, lentils, bitter vetch, chickpeas. This is also where goats and sheep were first domesticated. Chickens that are in parentheses were over in modern day China. But this is where it all began. And so then many, many years went by, and now, like, fast forward to the 1800s. This is so the late or mid to late 1700s and 1800s is when things dramatically changed during the agricultural revolution. So here's another question for you guys. Who are these people? Anybody know any of them? Far right is Gregor Mendel. Perfect. Anybody else can get the other ones? Those are a little bit more esoteric. So this is Robert Blakewell. He was an agronomist and a selective breeder. He had many hats and did many things, but he was able to use animal husbandry to increase meat production dramatically, and many of those principles kind of shaped animal husbandry for kind of from that time since. The next is Charles Townshend, who was one of the father of the cropping or crop rotations. So he invented the Norfolk four-course system, which there was 4 different crop rotations in that specific system. And then, of course, Gregor Mendel, who is the father of genetics. The next revolution that happened about 100 to 200 years later was the machine revolution. And, there's many pieces of equipment that are very familiar to you here. You can see on the far left, there's many iterations of the plow. A modern day plow looks nothing like that, as many of you know. You can see an old tractor and a combine. And here's another question for some of you guys that are in agriculture. What is this piece of equipment on the bottom? Anybody know? So this is the seed drill. And all of these had a huge impact on how we were performing agriculture. It went from mostly kind of manual labor to increasingly more mechanized. And so that leads me to the next revolution in agricultural systems. It's called the Green Revolution, where in the mid 1900s, and really it was at its peak in the like 1950s, 1970s, where this adoption of all of these practices that have come together, including chemical fertilizers and agrochemicals, pesticides, herbicides, and the introduction of some high-yielding varieties, especially of the cereals, as well as mechanizations and irrigation systems that were developed during the machine revolution. So who is the person right? I bet some of you know this. I'll give you a couple seconds. Who is the guy? This is Norman Borlaug. He is the father of standing in a Mexican wheat field back in 1970. Oh, I just saw. Oh, there it is. Somebody got it. Borlaug. My chat was just a little bit delayed. And so all of these kind of progressive or sequential changes in how we performed agriculture had huge impacts on a couple of things. First of all, the land was now able to support enormous population growth. And so if you look at human history from about 10,000 BC to about 1,000 BC, the world population grew from about 6 million people to about 120 million people. And so that's an increase of about 0.2% population increase per year. But then if you compare that to Europe in the 18 to 1900, the population tripled in about a period of 100 years. And so that's a population growth of 2.9% per year. So in other words, the rate of population growth increased more than tenfold with these advancements. And here's a graphical representation of what we just said, is that this is the global population from 10,000 BC all the way to the year 2000. And you can see this dramatic spike of the human population. And so now I've got, I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to ask you about this. So what is this? Does anybody know? It's a beautiful picture. I'll watch the chat, see if anybody can pick it up. Yep, it's a mill. So this is a rice mill from China around the turn of the century, from 1804. And I want to tell you a story about this young man who represents many young men in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And if you look at him, you'll notice his legs are very thin, and his toes seem to be unusually downturned. And so he has a nutritional problem, and it's related to this mill. Does anybody know why and what he has? This is going to be I'll be really impressed if somebody knows this. I'll give you just a couple seconds. Berry, Susan, you nailed it. So this young man has beriberi, where it is an imbalance of energy and micronutrient intake. And so this particular malnutritional disorder is called beriberi. It's from thiamine deficiency. And because the thiamine is in the outer layers of rice, and of course in many legume crops, and if you're subsisting on white rice, and now you have removed the pericarp and all the hull, you've removed all the thiamine essentially. And so you develop this neurologic and cardiovascular disorder, which is called beriberi. And so if we take a step back and look at what it is that humans need for life, you can actually boil it down to about 52 nutrients. And we as scientists will still argue about some other micronutrients and whether they're essential or not. But we seem to agree about that you need energy in form of carbon, which is food, and heat. You need water, you need oxygen, and then you need a wide range of different factors. You need essential protein or essential amino acids from protein. You need essential fatty acids, and you need essential vitamins and water-soluble vitamins and fat-soluble vitamins, as well as essential minerals. And there's other things that are conditionally essential, meaning that in early childhood, perhaps they're essential, or during pregnancy, perhaps they're essential, or patients that have certain medical disorders that they require other essential elements, but these are overall the group. And if you have a deficiency of any one of these nutrients, you will develop some sort of disease. And so as you look back at that list, if you go without any heat or any water or any oxygen, it causes disease much faster. If you go without some of these micronutrient deficiencies, it takes a little bit longer before you start developing problems, but you can see that there's a long list of problems that you develop. But while this is very interesting to me as a physician, as a pediatrician, what I really care about is this, that in low and middle income countries, malnutrition is associated with over half of childhood deaths. And sometimes it seems like a leap of like, oh, what do you mean? How does that happen? It doesn't seem like those are very deadly disorders, but I'll show you one example. Vitamin A deficiency leads to about 500,000 people every year becoming blind. And 50% of those that become blind will die within the year of developing blindness. And this is a completely preventable problem. And so I'll shift gears and talk a little bit about malnutrition and dietary health consequences. And I want to set the stage that malnutrition in all of its forms includes undernutrition, which can be divided into wasting, where you're too thin, stunting, where you have chronic malnutrition that results in decreased height, and underweight, as well as inadequate vitamins or minerals or micronutrient malnutrition. And it also includes overweight, obesity, and diet-related non-communicable diseases. And so if you look at children, this is updated data from 2023. Across the world, there's 148 million children under the age of 5 who are stunted, meaning that at some point in their life, they have had so few calories that their height velocity has been affected. And oftentimes that height can never be recovered. If you catch it early enough and restore their calories early enough while they're still in puberty or before puberty, you can sometimes catch up, but oftentimes you can never quite catch up. Wasting is where you're too thin, and this is more representative of acute nutrition or acute malnutrition. And overweight affects about 37 million children worldwide. So if we look at the distribution of different malnutritional disorders, this is a global hidden hunger index. And so this is a mixture of 3 different variables. This is stunting, iron deficiency anemia, and vitamin A deficiency. And you can see the distribution. It's predominantly sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. But at the same time, we've had the epidemic of obesity. So this is from 1975 to 2016. And you can see where, we went, earlier in the presentation, we were talking 10,000 BC, but we haven't been tracking obesity for that long. So since 1975, you can see that it's gone from about 10% in the United States to over 35, now 40%. And all other countries are following the exact same pattern, essentially. And if you look at children, this is from 2022, you can see the pattern is seemingly inversely related to where you saw most of those malnutrition, like the micronutrient malnutrition and stunting predominance. But what I think is really important to note is that none of these countries, the obese and overweight is 0. There's a few countries where no data is shown, but all of them have some degree of overweight and obesity. And some countries you can see are all the way in the 20%, 25%, even 30% of children have overweight or obesity. And similar, this is looking at total deaths related to obesity from 2021. And you can see that in some, especially Northern African countries, where the deaths related to obesity are between 15 and 25%. And in the United States, or essentially all of North America and South America, is 10 to 15%. These are very high numbers. And this is a beautiful article from 2018 from Nature, where they just mapped this. They mapped the US obesity prevalence with a couple of interesting inventions. So the invention of sugar, or refined sugar, you can see in kilograms per year is graphed in blue. Dairy is graphed in gray. And I would have really loved to see the obesity trend mapped all the way back to 1850 with this. Unfortunately, we don't have that data, but we can all presume that it's been increasing, which those may have been responsible for that increase. But then with the introduction of high fructose corn syrup and, interestingly, TV ads, you can see there's a correlation with US obesity prevalence that's quite striking. One of the other things that we are now facing in our country is so this is Generation X, who is just turning 60 over the past few years. They're experiencing the larger increases in incidence of leading cancers than any prior generation. And I'll get into the details of this a little bit. You can see lung cancers, lung cancers and cervical cancers are decreasing dramatically, and that is fabulous. There's been really some strong work done with smoking campaigns and cervical cancer screening, which has resulted in decreased incidence of those cancers. There's a few other cancers that have increased just because of, we can go into the details of why, but what's really stark is thyroid cancer, kidney cancer, rectal cancer, colon cancer, pancreatic cancer are all on the rise. And notably, they're all gastrointestinal cancers. And so gastrointestinal cancers are on the rise, not just in older people, but in younger people. Look at this red line on the graph on the right. So this is people aged 15 to 39, and this is new U.S. cancer rates. So this is all causes of cancer. But you can see compared to 1975, the incidence has increased pretty dramatically. Whereas total cancer rates in older age groups has decreased, which has been associated with all the good work that's been done with smoking and cervical cancer screening. And if you look on this left-hand figure, this is showing from 1999 up to 2019, the cancer incidence rates per 100,000 in the United States for people under 50. Young people, this is colorectal cancer, uterine cancers, kidney cancers, stomach cancers, and pancreatic cancers. And again, these are all related to the gastrointestinal tract, which is exposed to our diet. And so with that, I want to transition to talking about our food system and pulse crops. And before I get into it too far, I want to say this is a quote that I really, really like. It says, "Every system is perfectly designed to get the result that it does." Seems very, very logical, but surprisingly, people forget about it, and they like to blame side effects, and they call things side effects rather than that. That's a result of the system that is. Whether good or bad. And so here's our food system, again, going back to 10,000 BC. This is land use over time. And so in green is croplands, and in red is grazing, and then blue is built up, so like cities and roads. You can see the population growth and technological advancements all come together, where you can see our use of land has increased dramatically, but it does seem to have plateaued, where we've kind of maybe reached a limit of what we can do with our arable land. And if you divide up that land of total Earth's surface, and so 71% of the Earth is ocean, 29% is land. Of that land, 70% of it is habitable land. At least in 2019, 10% of it was covered in glaciers. I believe that number is now decreasing. And then 19% is barren land that can't be used, like deserts. And of the habitable land, about half of it is currently used for agriculture. About a third of it is forests, and then another smaller fraction is shrubs. And you can see agricultural land, about 75% of that agricultural land is used for livestock, and about a quarter of it is used for crops. Which leads me to another point of how much water do you need to produce food? And so, of course, this is going to vary with region because of rainfall, because of soil productivity. But this is just interesting to look at. So on the far left, it shows a couple of example foods. So apples, it takes about 700 liters of water to produce about a kilogram of apples. Cereals, about 1,300 liters of water to produce a kilogram of cereals. About 1,800 liters of water to produce a kilogram of soybeans. The pulse crops fall somewhere in between there. And then with animal products, you see a progressive increase all the way up to beef on the far right, which is about 15,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of food. And if we look at the United States now, the United States spends about $38 billion each year to subsidize meat, eggs, and dairy. And so here are the prices in 2024. It varies by region, but ground beef, you can see, is about $5 a pound. Eggs are about $3 a dozen. Dry beans and dry lentils, for comparison, about 50 cents and 30 cents a pound. If you were to have these foods without government subsidies, the projected price of what they're actually worth is more than $30 a pound for ground beef, more than $6 a dozen for eggs. And so I wanted to end this little discussion about the food system with a provocative and controversial graphic from 2016, where They took all of these data that we were just looking at and said, okay, if we have a set amount of heritable land or habitable and arable land with a specific population, if everyone on the planet were to eat the diets of, for example, people in the United States, how much land would we need? You know, theoretically, if we could have as much land as you want. And so countries in yellow, if people were to eat the diet of any of those countries in yellow, we have exactly enough or approximately enough heritable land or arable land to be able to sustain that diet. Countries in green, if everyone on the planet were eating the diet that was eaten in those countries, we would have more than enough land to sustain the population. And in countries in red, if everyone in the world were eating what Americans were eating or Australians were eating, there would not be enough land on Earth, and it's by a fairly large factor to be able to support everyone's diet. And so all of these discussion points that we've seen so far led the United Nations General Assembly in 2016 to declare it the International Year of Pulses. And that seems like a fairly abrupt segue. But like, what would bring the United Nations to declare an International Year of Pulses? And so I'll get into it a little bit. The pulse crops are dried seeds from the legume plant. Many, of course, you guys are all very familiar with these. My family and I are huge fans of dry beans, lentils, and chickpeas. Some of the other crops I've seen, I think I've tried cowpeas, and I think I've tried pigeon peas. Some of the other ones, I'll be honest, I've never even tried. I would love to try them. I have no idea how to cook them yet, but I'll learn. And there is this shared hypothesis that pulse crops are a vital component to a sustainable food system. And this is not just me. These are many people that are thinking about this and how important pulse crops are for a healthy food system. And to summarize some of the talking points is that, well, one, they're a really good source of protein. They're a good source of fiber. They're relatively low in fat. They're a good source of several micronutrients, particularly iron and vitamin B. They're very low carbon and water footprint relative to most foods, and they're nitrogen fixtures. And so they've been critical in crop rotations. And so with that, I'll show some of the health reasons why people are starting to say that these are really important. I recognize a name on here that's with us. That dietary pulses are associated with improved nutritional status. This was a study done in southern Ethiopia. And so suggesting that low pulses is an aggravating factor for poor nutritional status in these children. And if we look at this was an umbrella study where they did a systematic review of all of the data available. It was kind of an umbrella review and systematic analysis, looking at several different factors. So this vascular disease incidence. So you can see dietary pulses are associated with a decreased cardiovascular disease incidence by about 10% from these data. Coronary heart disease, same, about 10%. Hypertension, the same, and obesity, the same. All of these associated with dietary pulse consumption. And if you look at dietary legumes and nuts, there's another study that was done about over 100,000 patients where they looked at all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, and dementia mortality, where you can see that all three of those factors were associated with improvements with dietary legumes and nuts. I just saw before actually logging on, there's an updated article that I didn't have time to include as well, but kind of confirming the same trend that we're seeing. And you remember me talking about all of these gastrointestinal cancers, and we didn't have time to get into, well, what is causing that? And I have lots of theories, and lots of people have lots of theories, but I think this study was really important. So this was done in about 70,000 French adults, where they divided their consumption of organic foods. And so the amount of organic foods that they were consuming divided into quartiles. And if you compare the first quartile, which is the lowest intake of organic foods, to the fourth quartile, the highest intake, you can see that the protective effect against the incidence of cancer is about 25 to 30%. And there's a lot of confounding with this of like, well, what is it about organic foods? Is it small molecules? Is it pesticides, herbicides? Is it because people that eat an organic diet tend to eat a healthier diet? And this study doesn't break that out to be able to really know, but regardless, it's very interesting. And so for each 5-point increase in quartile of how much organic foods somebody was eating is associated with additional protective benefit. So to sum up everything that we've talked about so far, human advancements dramatically increase food production. That is for sure. And advancements also brought many unintended health consequences. So remember that every system is perfectly designed to get the result that it does. We have a food system that is getting the result that it does. Many people are eating food, and many people are eating enough food, but there are countries where they're not. Many people are getting enough nutrition. Many countries are also getting too much calories. Even though many people are getting enough nutrition, they're still undernourished in terms of micronutrients. And many people in all countries that are eating foods are developing gastrointestinal cancers at increasing rates. And so those are things to think about that we're going to have to address. And lastly, that pulse crops and organic foods in the literature have been shown to improve health on many levels. And so, if I had a request to all of you, is that, and many of you are already recognizing this and working on this, and many of you are writing some of the articles that I'm reading, is that our food system does need to change. And it's going to have to start with you and me. And I hope it doesn't start with some other natural disaster or horrible thing that happens to the human race. But it will need to change. But the question that I ask myself is, well, what can I do about it? First of all, I'm a pediatrician and I see patients. I'm also a scientist, but I mostly work on basic science. But I can choose pulse crops, and I can choose a more plant-based diet. I can choose whole foods, and I can choose organic. And, with increasing problem in younger generations, this affects my kids. And so then, this is where I think about, what am I doing as a family, but what are we doing as a community and as a nation and as a world? And what can our institutions do? Well, of course, keep conducting agriculture and food research and make sure to link them with health outcomes, because I think that's so critical. And what can our legislature do? I do think that it's time that we rethink government subsidization programs. They're very important, and I certainly am not an expert on this. But I do think that subsidization should also be tied to health outcomes, that we should be using our resources to the best. And I don't pretend to know what that is, but I'm sure there are many smart people out here that need to get involved in this. And so with all of that, thanks so much for listening. And I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments or thoughts that you guys have. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Casey. That was, as always, you advocate on pulses and bringing the current social issues which we are facing. And I was amazed to see how much the cancer connected into the food. Thank you for sharing that. Well, before my questions, I'm going to ask the questions coming from the experts in the community. So this question is from Dr. Whiting. You know, she is the Dr. Whiting, and everybody knows her area on pulses and health work. And also she's our next speaker next month. Her question is, Casey, comment on the food is medicine movement of Tufts University and others in the US. For example, should doctors prescribe pulses?
Yes. What a delightful question. So there is a large movement in medicine and in universities that food is medicine. And as a pediatric GI doctor, we use food as medicine all the time for specific problems, irritable bowel syndrome, constipation. So I'm thinking about food as medicine for those specific syndromes all the time. And I'm counseling my patients on this all the time. And Dylan and I were just talking about this on the phone that, constipation largely, and there are always exceptions, but largely is a problem of the food system. It's about a third to a half of all Americans that have constipation, and it simply wouldn't exist in nearly those numbers if we didn't have refined flours and white rice. It just wouldn't. Irritable bowel syndrome, the same. We definitely see a relationship to what we're having our patients eat to how their symptoms are going. But more than this, and something that we don't think about, as pediatricians at least, is risk of adult problems. I want to make sure that somebody's growing according to their growth curves. They're not growing too fast. They're not growing too slow. I want to make sure that all their growth parameters are normal. And I think pediatricians were really good at giving general advice. But what about advice for when you become 80? And that is really hard because it requires a whole change from the whole family. I can't. I see it over and over again that if I recommend a dietary change to the patient, they come back and it never happens unless I'm able to convince the parents that it's important for them too. It's important for all of us. And so, yes, doctors should be talking about it. The hard thing is making that happen. And because there's so many pressures on a doctor's time. And there's frankly a lack of robust information for doctors to dive into that they're being exposed to. There's lots of good information that's been published, but most doctors aren't reading the kind of articles that we're talking about today. They're reading medical journals.
Absolutely. I have a follow-up question for that because so when I introduce the pulse crops to the general audience, pulses you're one of my first grad students, so they are gluten-free, allergen-free. But recently, I have been hearing these stories from the young kids that they are allergic to lentils and they are allergic to chickpeas. Is this the continuation from the peanut allergies? But physiologically, they don't have gluten and the allergen. So is this something that would you like to comment on?
Sure. So you can develop a true allergy to essentially any protein. And so it is theoretically possible. That being said, the antigens in pulse crops are exceedingly unlikely to develop an allergy. And so the increased trend, I admit I haven't looked into this data specifically to pulses, but the increased trend in allergies is more reflective of an increased trend in allergies across the board, is that patients are getting more allergies today than they did 100 years ago, period. And so because of that, they're getting more allergies to all things. And so I suspect that that's what it is. And it's not that somehow somehow pulses are now causing allergies. It's that allergies across the board are increasing. The other thing that happens is a misconception of what an allergy is. And so sometimes people say, I got an upset stomach and therefore I'm allergic to it. And, that's probably not true. And some of those symptoms are related to like a dysfunctional microbiome because you've been eating processed foods for your entire degree that somebody else would. But the nice thing is that the GI system is incredible, and it adapts. It adapts to new changes. So,
thank you for that comment. So, there's another question. Interesting. It's a comment. Are there countries that seek out compared to the rest of the world where using organic pulses has helped with overall nutrition and reduce the rate of certain types of cancers? So what you're doing is actually educating people. We are not asking people just to eat organic pulses. We are communicating to have more on the regular pulses. So do you have any thoughts on that?
yeah, I guess first of all, no, I don't know of any specific data, but I would be fascinated to see it if it comes out. I try to, in the data that I presented, try to be as broad as possible to think about these are things that we know based on association, but establishing causality is much more challenging, and takes different study designs, many of which are like near impossible to actually get to happen. So the question of which countries eats more of them, or eats more pulses, or eats more organic, would be very interesting, but it would have to be a very well designed study, because with different cultural practices come different exposure to different foods and different toxins and different genetics, and susceptibility to different diseases. So I'm not aware of those data. If you are, please let me know. I'd love to see it.
We will have another discussion at some point. So there is another question from these breeders that we train in our program. So their question is, people are following new diets like keto, paleo, and control to their obesity and the fat, control their obesity. What is your point of view about these specific diets, and how can they impact overall health and nutrition availability? That's kind of a broad question.
Yeah.
I know you can do recommendation. You are a pediatrician, but any recommendation or anything?
Yeah, it's actually a great question, because I have patients and families come in and ask about this all the time, and usually they don't tell me. They're like, we're already trying this, and then they want me to either tell them that they're doing the right thing. But there are many diets, and in children, unless they tell me we're trying to eat a Mediterranean diet, or unless they tell me we're trying to include more vegetables, or unless they tell me we're trying to eat foods, which that very rarely somebody tells me that, I usually have to ask a lot more questions, because it makes me a little bit nervous. Anytime you restrict any food category in children, you develop a risk of developing an eating disorder, both psychiatrically and micronutrient malnutrition. Anytime you eliminate a food group, you increase the risk. And so those diets, I typically, if I'm going to recommend it to a patient, I will say we're going to do a time-limited trial for this reason. Gluten-free diet, for example, is the only known treatment for celiac disease. And almost indefinitely, there are problems with the gluten-free diet. Like they need to be on it, and they will get much better if they have celiac disease. But I have to counsel them. But there are things in this diet that are going to be harder for you to do, and we need to pay attention to them. And so there's more general diets that you mentioned, like the keto diet. What was the other diet that you mentioned?
Keto, paleo.
Keto, paleo.
Yeah.
And so what I suspect, is that they're probably not the answer, in terms of I'm not going to go around recommending these diets to everybody. What I do recommend is more plant-based is good, but not at the expense of health. And so some people, eating a more plant-based diet is hard. For people and families that have not grown up eating a plant-based diet, it's hard to get enough protein. It's hard to get enough iron. It's hard to get enough things. That being said, if it can be done, it will improve your health.
Absolutely.
And those are the things.
So we are kind of running out of time, but we have two more questions, which is very interesting. One question even I can answer, but I want you to think about this one. Knowledge is power, but behavior change is hard, which you advocate all the time. Americans are considered to process food, meat, dairy. What can be learned from positive changes or reduction in tobacco use in the US?
What an amazing question.
Exactly. Thank you, Alan, for asking this.
I think that a lot of things can be learned, but if you look back at the timeline for tobacco change, when there were doctors recommending I smoke this kind of brand of cigarettes, and it had to be a cultural shift. So first, data had to come out to prove what was happening. That's the step number one. And we're just at that stage where within the last 10 years, we're finally generating the data to say, there's a problem here. And so the next step is going to be advocacy, where, the government started getting involved and saying, we don't want, smoking, we set age limits. And then we say, you're not allowed to advertise towards kids. And then it started in Massachusetts where they increased it to age 21, where you're not able to have it. And then they illegalize all flavor additives to be able to, at least in this state. And so they've made, these stepwise changes. With the food system, I think we're going to have to take a bit more cautious approach, because in the case of smoking, there's no benefit except for pleasure. And there's lots of harms. With food, there's definite benefit to all food for somebody that is starving. And so it's a much more calculated approach. You know what I mean? And it deserves a long discussion.
That deserves that's like a really good question, and only Casey you can answer that question, because you are actually a practitioner as well as the nutrition background and all of that. This is the last question. We already ran out of time. There are many questions, but this is interesting. Where can we individual obtain safe pulse seeds? Are they under threat to be converted into GMO? Answer is no. There are any concerns with glyphosate application in current pulse crops?
I'm going to defer these questions to more agricultural-based people. The one thing that I will say about glyphosate, there was an article that I was studying just a while back in a low and middle income country. I won't mention the name, but it had been thought that the half-life of glyphosate in the soil was much lower, but it turns out under certain mineral and pH conditions, the half-life can be extended dramatically. And so country in that setting, we were seeing a huge rise in kidney failure. And so I think there are risks that should be considered. But to say more than that, I would leave it to people that know better than me.
So yes, we can buy safe pulse seeds from anywhere. I mean, to eat, you can go to Whole Food, you could go to Trader Joe's, anywhere you can buy like a locally produced pulses, as well as like a lot of pulses are coming from Canada. US is not producing that much. Dr. Whiting will address that in next talk. And also my breeding program is organic. I am not planning to do GMO. I don't think pulses are GMO yet. So I don't think it is one reason that Europe and everywhere buying pulses, because they are non-GMO and they go to the third world countries. And also, are there any concerns for glyphosate application? Casey answered that. For the organic production, we are not applying any glyphosate or any pesticide into the organic production. So pretty soon, hopefully year after next year, you will be able to get the South Carolina organic pulses in the grocery store. So thank you so much. And we had wonderful more questions coming up, but we are running out of time. I really want to thank you, Casey, for coming and sharing your wisdom with the community. And because we are hungry on the education of these new ideas and how we can proceed. So that's why this webinar series is designed to bring these speakers and educate our society. So thank you so much again. Our next speaker going to be Dr. Susan Whiting, a legend from Canada on nutrition, and she used to be a professor at the University of Saskatchewan. We all got learned from her, and she's coming to Clemson, and all these experts will be here in April in-person discussion. So we will meet again October 30th at 10 a.m. And I'm looking forward to all of your questions. And if you have other questions, just email me or Tristan, and we will answer your questions. Thank you so much for your time. Goodbye.